The day I realized my new piece of land wasn't actually empty, it wasn't because I found trash on it or saw kids cutting across it. It was because I found a massive white trailer sitting right in the middle of property I had just spent months saving up to buy. What made it even stranger was that when I politely asked the owner to move it, he looked at me like I was the one causing a problem. Looking back now, that trailer was never really the issue. The real problem was what happened when people get comfortable treating something that isn't theirs like it belongs to them. My name is Garrett Lawson, and this happened a few years ago in a quiet town called Millfield, Indiana. The kind of place where everybody seemed to know everybody, where people still waved from their trucks, where front porch conversations lasted longer than planned, and where most disagreements never became anything serious. At least that's what I believed at the time. My wife Megan and I had lived there for over a decade. We weren't wealthy, but we had built a good life. We raised our daughter there, made friends there, and slowly fixed up our house one project at a time. Right beside our property sat an empty corner lot that had been neglected for years. The owner lived out of state and rarely visited. It was nothing special to most people, just gravel, patches of grass, and weeds fighting for survival every summer. But every time I looked at it, I saw potential. For years I dreamed about buying it. I restore old motorcycles as a hobby, and my garage had become so crowded that finding a wrench sometimes felt like an archaeological excavation. I always imagined building a small workshop there one day, nothing extravagant, just a place where I could work without bumping into lawnmowers, bicycles, and storage boxes every 5 minutes. So when the lot finally hit the market, I moved fast. The deal closed without any issues, and I remember walking across the property that first evening feeling proud of myself. Not because it was a huge accomplishment financially, but because it represented something I had wanted for years. I stood there watching the sun go down, already picturing where the workshop might sit, where I could pour a concrete slab, where I could finally organize all my tools. It felt like one of those small victories that don't seem important to anybody else, but mean everything to you. About a week later, that feeling disappeared. I pulled into my driveway after work and immediately noticed a large enclosed trailer sitting near the center of the lot. At first I assumed somebody had made an honest mistake. Maybe a contractor had parked it temporarily. Maybe somebody was visiting nearby. I wasn't worried. The next morning it was still there. A few days later it was still there. By the following weekend it hadn't moved an inch. That's when I walked over for a closer look. The trailer wasn't simply parked there. It looked established. The tires had settled slightly into the gravel. Dirt had built up around the edges. The paint on one side was faded from years of sunlight. Everything about it suggested this trailer had been sitting there for a very long time. Much longer than I had owned the property. I started asking around the neighborhood. Most people weren't sure who owned it. Some shrugged and said they never really paid attention. Then an older neighbor named Linda pointed across the street toward a tan ranch-style house. "Pretty sure that's Dale Mercer's trailer," she told me. "It's been there forever." Forever. That word stuck with me. The next morning I walked over and knocked on Dale's door. He answered holding a coffee mug and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. After introducing myself, I asked if the trailer belonged to him. He nodded immediately. "Sure does." I smiled and kept things friendly. "Well, I recently bought that corner lot, and I was wondering when you'd be able to move it." For a second I expected surprise. Maybe an apology. Maybe some version of, "I didn't know the property had sold." Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee and said, "We've been using that space for years." I laughed lightly because I genuinely thought he was joking. "Right, but it's my property now." Another sip. "Yeah." Then silence. I waited. Surely there was more coming. There wasn't. Finally I asked again, "So when do you think you could move it?" He shrugged. "We'll move it when we need to." I remember standing there completely confused. Not angry yet. Just confused. It felt like we were having two different conversations. I explained again that I had purchased the lot and wanted it cleared. He looked past me toward the trailer and said something I'd hear repeatedly over the next several weeks. "It ain't hurting anything." Those 4 words became his entire argument. Every conversation ended there. Every request hit the same wall. It ain't hurting anything. Meanwhile, every morning I'd look out my kitchen window and see that trailer sitting on land I had legally bought. One evening Megan caught me staring at it again while washing dishes. She followed my eyes toward the lot and laughed. "Still thinking about that trailer?" she asked. Unfortunately, she dried her hands and looked outside for a moment. You know what's funny? What? I think they've had it there so long they forgot it wasn't theirs. We both laughed at the time, but later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Maybe that was exactly what had happened. The lot had sat empty for years. Nobody challenged them. Nobody enforced boundaries. Nobody reminded them whose property it actually was. Over time, convenience had slowly transformed into entitlement. In their minds, the trailer belonged there because it always had. The problem was that now there was an owner standing in the picture, and they didn't seem interested in accepting that reality. Still, I wanted to avoid conflict. I really did. Over the next couple weeks, I tried everything I could think of. Friendly conversations, gentle reminders, a handwritten note left in their mailbox. Every effort was ignored. Every request disappeared into the same indifferent shrug. Eventually, I realized something uncomfortable. Dale wasn't refusing because moving the trailer was difficult. He was refusing because he genuinely believed I wouldn't do anything about it. He thought being polite meant being weak. He thought eventually I'd get tired of asking and simply let it go. What he didn't know was that while he was ignoring me, I had quietly started researching local property regulations, and once I discovered what the law actually allowed, the countdown on that trailer had officially begun. The funny thing about dealing with entitled people is that they usually mistake patience for surrender. Dale certainly did. Every time I approached him, every time I stayed calm, every time I chose a conversation over a confrontation, he seemed more convinced that eventually I'd stop bothering him. And for a while, maybe I even looked like the kind of guy who would. I wasn't interested in neighborhood drama. I wasn't trying to win some battle. I simply wanted to use the property I had paid for. But after weeks of getting nowhere, I finally sat down one evening at my kitchen table with my laptop and started researching local ordinances. Megan was sitting across from me reading a book when she noticed the look on my face. "That doesn't look like motorcycle research," she said. "It's not. Trailer research." I nodded. "Trailer research." She smiled. Should I be worried? Not yet. The truth was, I didn't know what I was going to find. For all I knew, I might have to hire an attorney or spend months dealing with paperwork. But the more I read, the more interesting things became. The property records were clear. The lot belonged to me. There were no easements, no special agreements, no grandfathered arrangements that allowed neighboring owners to store equipment there. More importantly, the county had very specific rules regarding unauthorized vehicles on private property. Property owners could have vehicles removed legally under certain conditions. There was a process. There were requirements. And one particular requirement immediately caught my attention. Proper signage. I read that section 3 times just to make sure I understood it correctly. Then I read it again. The next morning I called the county office. A woman named Karen patiently answered my questions. "If I follow all the requirements?" I asked. "Then yes," she replied. "The vehicle can be removed, even if it's been there a long time, especially if it's there without permission." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat back in my chair and stared out the window at that white trailer. For the first time since buying the lot, I wasn't frustrated. I was calm, because now there was a solution. Not an argument, not revenge, a solution. That weekend I drove to a local sign company and ordered 2 large reflective signs. They weren't subtle. Bright white background, bold red lettering, private property, tow-away zone. Unauthorized vehicles will be removed at owner's expense. The owner of the sign shop glanced at the wording and grinned. "Somebody giving you trouble? You could say that. These usually get people's attention." That's the idea. A few days later I installed them myself. One near the entrance to the lot, another clearly visible from the street. There was no way anyone could honestly claim they hadn't seen them. I remember stepping back when I finished and thinking that they looked almost comically obvious. If the signs had been any larger, passing airplanes probably could have read them. Then I waited. 1 day passed. Nothing. 2 days. Nothing. 3 days. The trailer didn't move an inch. I almost couldn't believe it. I started wondering if Dale had even noticed the signs. Then on the 4th day I saw him standing near the trailer while I was mowing my lawn. He looked directly at one of the signs, stared at it for several seconds, then walked away. That was the moment everything changed in my mind. Before that, I had still given him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he hadn't realized I was serious. But after watching him read the warning and ignore it, there was no room left for misunderstanding. He knew exactly what was happening. He simply believed the rules wouldn't apply to him. That evening Megan asked, "So what's next?" I looked out the window. The trailer sat exactly where it had always sat. Now we follow through. The next morning, I called a licensed towing company. The manager listened carefully while I explained the situation. He asked for photographs, documentation proving ownership, and pictures showing the warning signs. I emailed everything immediately. About an hour later, he called back. Everything looks good. So it can be removed? Legally? Yes. I thanked him and scheduled the service. After hanging up, I felt something unexpected. Not excitement. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because the uncertainty was finally over. For weeks I'd been stuck in a situation where every attempt at being reasonable had failed. Now the issue was moving into the hands of a process. A legal process. A neutral process. The kind that didn't care about opinions or excuses. The towing appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon. And I'll admit, I was curious whether Dale would suddenly decide to move the trailer once he saw the truck arrive. Part of me expected some last-minute scramble. Maybe he'd rush outside. Maybe he'd hook it up himself. Maybe he'd finally take the situation seriously. The next day was unusually quiet. Around noon I worked from home and kept glancing outside. Everything looked normal. Birds in the trees. Kids riding bicycles down the street. A delivery truck stopping a few houses away. Then shortly after 2 o'clock, the tow truck arrived. It was impossible to miss. A large flatbed rolled slowly down the street before turning into the lot. I stepped outside as the driver climbed down. He introduced himself as Rick. Friendly guy. Professional. No drama. He reviewed the paperwork one final time, checked the signs, took photographs for his records, and then got to work. The whole process felt strangely routine. That surprised me. For weeks this situation had occupied space in my head every single day. Yet for the towing company, it was just another Tuesday afternoon. Rick lowered the equipment, attached the trailer, secured the connections, and started loading it onto the flatbed. Watching it happen felt surreal. That trailer had become such a permanent part of the landscape that seeing it move almost looked wrong. Like a tree suddenly deciding to walk away. Across the street, I noticed curtains moving inside Dale's house. Somebody was watching. Maybe him. Maybe his wife. Nobody came outside. Nobody said a word. Within 20 minutes the trailer was fully secured. Rick climbed back into the truck. Before leaving, he looked at me and asked, "You all set?" I glanced at the now empty lot. For the first time since purchasing it, I could actually see the property again. Open gravel. Grass. Space. Possibility. Yeah, I said. I think I am. The truck pulled away carrying the trailer down the road and around the corner until it disappeared from view. I stood there for another minute, taking in the silence. The whole ordeal that had dragged on for weeks was over in less than half an hour. What I didn't know was that the real confrontation hadn't happened yet. Because about an hour later, a loud knock rattled my front door, and standing on the other side was a furious Dale Mercer whose face was so red I honestly thought he might be having a medical emergency. The moment I opened that door, I knew the quiet part of this story was officially over. The second I opened the door, Dale exploded. "Where the hell is my trailer?" he demanded before I could even say hello. His face was bright red, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles moving. And for a moment, I just stood there looking at him. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I was honestly surprised he seemed shocked. The signs had been there for days. We'd had multiple conversations. I'd left notes. I'd asked politely more times than I could count. Yet somehow he was acting like this had come completely out of nowhere. "Your trailer was towed," I said calmly. "You had it towed." The disbelief in his voice was almost impressive. "Yes. You can't do that." I pointed past him toward the lot where the warning signs were still standing. "Actually, I can." He turned, looked at the signs, then looked back at me. For a few seconds neither of us said anything. Then came the argument I had expected weeks earlier. Suddenly he had reasons. Suddenly he had explanations. Suddenly moving the trailer wasn't as simple as I'd been told. He talked about how long it had been there. He talked about how nobody had complained before. He talked about how inconvenient this was going to be. Finally I interrupted him. "Dale, I asked you to move it. It wasn't hurting anything." There it was again. The same line. The same excuse. The same justification I'd heard over and over. But this time it sounded different. Not confident. Not dismissive. Desperate. I looked at him and said, "That wasn't your decision to make. It wasn't your property." For a second I thought he was going to keep arguing, but something changed in his expression. Maybe he realized the conversation was over. Maybe he realized the trailer wasn't magically coming back. Or maybe he finally understood that the situation had never been about a trailer at all. It had been about boundaries, about respect, about assuming someone else's property existed for your convenience. Without another word, he turned around and walked back toward his house. That was the last real conversation we ever had about it. The next few weeks were surprisingly quiet. No retaliation, no legal threats, no late-night drama, just silence. The lot remained empty. Every morning when I looked out the window, I saw exactly what I had paid for. Open space, clean ground, possibilities. Eventually, I started planning the workshop again. Survey stakes appeared. Contractors stopped by to give estimates. The future I had imagined before all the drama slowly started becoming real. And something interesting happened around the neighborhood. People started talking. Not in a bad way. More in a fascinated way. A few neighbors approached me while I was outside working and quietly admitted they weren't surprised by what happened. Apparently, Dale had developed a reputation over the years for pushing boundaries whenever nobody challenged him. Borrowing space. Taking liberties. Assuming rules were flexible when they became inconvenient. Most people simply avoided confrontation because they didn't want the headache. One afternoon, Linda, the neighbor who originally told me who owned the trailer, stopped by while I was marking out part of the workshop foundation. She smiled and said, "You know, I never thought anybody would actually make him move that thing." I laughed. Technically, I didn't. She laughed even harder. The truth is, I don't hate Dale. I never did. Looking back, I think he genuinely convinced himself that using the lot for years somehow gave him a special claim to it. Human beings do that sometimes. We get comfortable. We create stories that justify our behavior. We convince ourselves that because something has always been a certain way, it should stay that way forever. But ownership doesn't work like that. Respect doesn't work like that. Community definitely doesn't work like that. Good neighbors aren't people who take advantage of each other and hope nobody notices. Good neighbors respect boundaries because they understand boundaries are what allow communities to function in the first place. A few months later, my workshop was finally under construction. I remember standing in the middle of the lot one evening watching the sun go down, almost exactly where that trailer used to sit. The concrete slab had been poured. The framing was going up. And for the first time since buying the property, I felt the same pride I'd felt on closing day. Not because I had won some battle, not because somebody else lost, but because I had stood up for something simple and reasonable without becoming unreasonable myself. I followed the rules. I gave warnings. I gave opportunities. And when those opportunities were ignored, I let the process do its job. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the most effective response isn't anger, revenge, or endless arguments. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone else's entitlement become your responsibility. Even now, every time I walk into that workshop and start working on one of my motorcycles, I think about that trailer. Not because I miss it. Trust me, I don't. But because it's a reminder that people will often treat your boundaries exactly the way you allow them to. The moment you stop defending them, somebody else may decide they own them. But here's the question I've always wondered about. If you had been in my position, would you have had the trailer towed when I did? Or would you have given Dale one more chance? Do you think I handled it fairly? Or do you think I should have been more patient with a neighbor who had been using that space for years? Let me know in the comments because even now, years later, people in town still disagree about who was right. And honestly, that's what makes this story so interesting.